as you probably know, about a little over an hour or so around there, or give or take too. But
Well, anyways, no one much will see it, but that's okay.
well, it's all important, and it's about what you want to tell us, not even so much what I want to ask you. And what I'm going to do here is go ahead and start and state that my name is Sarah Eberhard, and interviewing Mary Evans Comstock on December 1st, 2004 at the Atlanta History Center for our Veterans History Project Homefront interview. And if I just get you to state your name and date of birth again.
I'm Mary Evans Comstock, and I was born January 7th, 1923.
Okay, thank you very much. We are just going to, I'm just going to start by, even though we will concentrate on your, the World War II, your activities during that time, but start with, you were born in Huntsville, Alabama, and just some of your background leading up to your college years, and then ending up in working for the Navy Department in Washington.
Well, I guess I would start really being in college and hearing the news of the war.
And this was when you were in Nashville?
I was in Nashville, and it was on a Sunday afternoon, and we heard the news on the radio, and everyone gathered in our room, and my roommate's boyfriend was in the National Guard, and she immediately said, I'm going home to be with him. So she just packed her bag and left, and I didn't have a roommate, of course, so someone came immediately, but that was interesting, and I think we really just kind of were shocked and looked at one another. What are we to do? What is happening? So at the age of 18, you don't really realize how important and how really devastating the war was, which is maybe good.
Yes. Now, had there been, as you were mentioning, because you sometimes don't realize leading up to it, when there was the war, when it had been going on in Europe up to this point, had there been a lot of attention, or had the magnitude of it?
Well, I think this may be interesting. When I was in high school in 1940, that's when the Hitler invaded Germany, invaded many of the countries, and the principal, at that time we had chapel in the mornings.
And where were you in high school? Was this in Huntsville?
Yes, and anyway, he would tell us, he was in World War II, and so he would come in and tell us the process of Hitler, and when he did tell us, then 1940, when he invaded France and so on, he said, I think there's going to be a war. And so I think I was prepared mentally about what is happening, but when it really happens, you feel your feelings entirely change.
When was I guess you mentioned your roommate's boyfriend in college. When was the first that you began to notice, young men and like, in your either friends or family or whatever going over? Was that immediately after Pearl Harbor? How soon was it?
Well, we were all in college, and I didn't know anyone at that time that was going then, because most people were in school and were able to finish college. So I didn't really know until my sister went to Washington, I guess in 42, or maybe in early 42, and so when I went back to school then, she said, maybe you'd like to join me, and I said, oh yes. I felt really patriotic. I would like to go to Washington, and so I didn't know exactly what I could do, but I took typing in shorthand, and was excited about going, and I did go, and when we first got when I went into Washington, there was lots of young people, mostly women at the time, and we were put in a pool. That's the way they sorted them out, and you were going to be assigned a certain job. And we're sitting there all very naive, not anticipating where we would go or what, and they were taking pictures, and so my picture appeared in the Washington paper. This person has come up from Alabama to be in the war effort. So that was, I didn't think much about it, but I realize now that was right nice, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so then I was assigned to the Secretary of Navy, Forrestal's office, and that in turn was a very elegant place and lots going on. And I did not work directly for Forrestal, but I worked for a man called Mr. Flippin, who was a Navy graduate, and I was really, he had a secretary, so I was receptionist and did typing in shorthand. And at the same time, William C. Bullitt had just returned from Russia as ambassador, so I in turn took his phone calls and did some work for him, but he had a secretary, so I was kind of the front person for those people. And consequently, it was interesting because the Bullets were very good friends of the Roosevelts, and their daughters particularly were in touch. So Mrs. Roosevelt would call about his daughter, and I was able to talk to those people, which seemed at the time just a normal thing that one does in Washington if you're going. But when I think back, I think it was an experience I didn't realize was unusual that I was able to do that. So I worked, and one of the experiences working for William C. Bullitt is he came in one time, he'd just come back from Russia, as I said, and he handed me something and told me to type it, and I could not make a mistake, and there would be no erasers. And it was a long letter, and so I was very nervous doing this, hoping that I would complete it. I did. He didn't send over me or check it, but he checked it afterward, and I was accepted. So I felt, oh, I have arrived. And those experiences were, I think, interesting to remember.
And now you said your sister had previously gone out.
Yeah, she had gone with the FBI.
Oh
She was
goodness.
older than I was, and she had finished college, and so she had gone as a war effort. I mean, you know, we all, let's go. So that was kind of unusual, I suppose.
Was she having some interesting experiences too with the FBI, or could she talk about them?
Well, she did fingerprinting, counting fingerprints, and I was thinking, gee, that's really hard because you couldn't make any mistakes. You could make, you know, you'd have a certain amount you had to count during a day, and you couldn't make any mistakes either. So anyway, occasionally, I mean, I guess if you made 3, then you're not qualified for the job, so you could have to do something else. But she stayed up. She did okay.
Now, was there a lot of, in your position, was there a lot of flurries of activities or things leading up to major operations that were taking, when you look back, that were taking place in the war, or did you?
Well, we were very active in relationship to the war. First, we had later, I mean, not right at first, but we had friends and relatives over, so we spent time wrapping packages that had to be wrapped very carefully, and we would stand in line in Washington, a very long line to mail them. So we felt good about doing that. We always had a good feeling. We bought treasury bonds, and we also went to the USO, and I at that point was taking some voice lessons, so some other good friends who were singing well, we would go and sing, and I don't even remember what all we sang, but anyway, we would go down there to sing, the USO, and then most all of the places that you saw the soldiers and so on, they were all out in the different places, so you were very in contact with them.
And so your social life pretty much.
Yes, we socialized with some, because it was the Quantico, you know.
Yeah.
Was there. People came up from Quantico, and so at that time, so. And Navy, of course, I was in the Navy, so the department, so.
Right.
You saw some people, but of course, most people in the Navy were overseas.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, you were associated with them.
And was it at this point that you started having more friends, and did you have any family members that were over at that time, or?
Yeah, we had just cousins. We were the oldest in our family, so my sister and I had 3 brothers younger, but they were 4 and 5 years.
Yeah.
So it was mostly cousins and friends that, you know, that had gone later.
Now, the war was still going on when you had, were you still in Washington then in middle of 44 when you left the Navy Department? Let's see.
Well, yes, I left the Navy Department because Mr. Flippin, my immediate boss, was a Naval Academy graduate, and he decided to go to sea. He said he'd sat there long enough. He had to get out, and with that, this office was disintegrated, and so I was sent to another office, which was fine, but it wasn't quite as exciting as where I had been, and I was doing more routine work, and I thought, I'd like to get out too, so I applied for a job with the airlines as a hostess. That's what it was called. The airline was PCA in Washington, D.C., right there, so I applied, and I was taken. It was one of the first classes that they had. I think I was in the 5th graduating class, and we were flying DC-3s and 21 people, and immediately I was put on the Norfolk Shuttles, and the Norfolk Shuttles were the DC-3s who went down from Washington to Norfolk to pick up the sailors, or most of them were mostly sailors that had just come in, and it'd be 21, and you'd stand there, and those sailors were so jubilant and so excited, so the entire 45 minutes, I think it was how long it was then, it was a DC-3 which went about 180 miles per hour, so anyway, they'd be so excited about coming home, and so that in itself was a real joy for me, and for them.
Yeah. Let's see, so you were, actively working as a hostess then throughout the, like the last year and a half of the war. What other experiences did you have during that time that?
Well, it was most people flying priority, of course, that flew then, because there wasn't that many seats, and flying was not that. People didn't fly that much anyway at the time. In other words, we were to teach people that flying is safe.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of unusual now, but that was one of the things we were doing. But then, after for a while in Washington, I did that. Then they opened a base in New York, and I went to New York, and going there, it was another experience, because we had an apartment, 6 girls rented an apartment at Jackson Heights, right near the LaGuardia Field, and we would try to get a cab, because we sometimes we would have to walk. We'd try to get a cab, and the cab driver would say, wasn't very long, he would tell us no gas, because gas was rationed during the war. And we learned to tell him, or it was a man at that time, buying cabs in New York, to tell him, well, just drive to the next police station then. We'll go to and of course, he knew that we knew that he wasn't supposed to not take us regardless, so, or take anyone, but depending on their route, whether they were going to make money or not, is the way they decided where they were going to do. So that in itself, and of course lots of rationing back in those days, both in Washington and New York, and we had, I remember we bought treasury bonds. We felt, and I wondered, what happened to my treasury bonds? I guess I must have cashed them somewhere along the way. They're not in my possession now. So anyway, those are things that you have to really think back, that what happened at that time. And we were a group, we were 6 were living, and then people were coming back then from the war, and they would be, we would have new people, men coming in, you know, to tell us stories and so on, so that was interesting. And if you'd like me to get to the end of the war, we were sitting there in New York when this happened.
Oh my goodness.
And we were just sitting, listening to the radio, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Sonata or some such, and the radio, they said, the war has ended. And you can imagine how excited we were. Well, immediately we just hastily got dressed and said we're going to Times Square. So we hopped the subway and went to Times Square, and all the people on the subway were joyous. And
what time of day was that? Do you remember?
it must have been late in the afternoon, because we were there at night celebrating. So I don't remember the exact time, but I know it was at night that we were there celebrating. And when we got off the subway, bells were ringing, church bells were ringing, and horns were blowing, and it was just so exciting. And then we looked, and here was this flow of sailors again, and I was very involved with sailors, it seems, and they came and would grab us and hug us and, just sweep you off your feet practically. And it was so interesting because everyone was participating. It wasn't like no one was singled out for anything. It was just that this is a great day for everyone. This was the atmosphere. So that's so exciting. That, I guess, was a highlight of my participation in the war, being on Times Square.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, as you were, you had mentioned that in your working as a hostess then, that you were, a lot of the passengers were people returning from towards the end of the war, and were you still doing just one particular route, or were you flying have a variety of routes out of New York, or?
I'm trying to think if this was during the war that I had out of New York, but I had various routes, out of, I guess, this one, you just want something during the war years.
Or, no, I mean, even in the post-war, in the post-war years as you were,
well, the post-war years were, I guess, exciting because I was flying the southern route, and that was kind of during the some elections, and the presidential elections, and some of the candidates like Henry Wallace would be on my flight. And
I mean, that would be very interesting if you would tell us some about that. Because the elections were, let's see, that.
I have to think what year.
Yeah. Would that have been in 46?
Yes, I guess so. That was really post-war. That
Yeah.
a lot of things.
So that would have been, about a year after.
And so that was when he was running. It was in the South, and he was not as well thought of because it was a new party starting,
Right.
that sort of thing. So anyway, he sat up on the front seat, and I announced to them that Paul Robeson was with him as well, and so most of the people weren't really interested. I noticed that, And then several people would ask, "You didn't talk politics to your pass. You spent a lot of time in conversation with your passengers because you had 21 and you took an hour or two between flights. A lot of times that's what you did, was talk to people." And I remember every so often they would ask me, something about who you for or how, and I would tell them if I was frank, but it would never be any sort of political discussion, saying why or when or how about you.
Now, how many hostesses did you have on a flight? Was it just you, or did you have two?
No, I was just one.
Just one. And how many?
We sat back on the jump seat,
and
there were 21. You had 2 pilots at the time, and so I guess it was interesting flying then.
And so how long did you continue flying then?
Well, I went from New York. I went to Birmingham for a bit, but then chief hostess down there, and then they opened a base in New Orleans, and that was 1948, and so I went there, and I met my husband then, and a year later I retired, because at that point you couldn't work after you were married.
Now, had he been in the service?
Yes, he was in the Navy, an officer in the Navy. He had finished college and gone right into the Navy up at Columbia and for the training, and then went into the service and got out in, I guess, 46. He must have 46 or 7, and came to New Orleans to work.
Okay.
He was a baseball player, but he had lost a lot of time and had to find another profession.
Where had he played baseball?
In Pensacola was where he was. Pensacola Flyers.
For the Navy.
So,
okay. We used to vacation in Pensacola.
Oh, did you? Don't you like it?
Oh, everything's torn down now. All the places we used to go.
So that's really kind of my story.
I just think all of this is so interesting. Is there anything else, during your time at the Navy Department? I mean, you touched on some really interesting things, like some of even the little things, the phone calls you got, or some of your social activities, things like that that you think of that are just little stories of interest, because they're all so...
Well, some of the things it was a friend of our family's that the lady had been up since World War II, and we lived with her in the condominium, my sister, and she was very involved with lots of organizations. She was a writer as well, and so we got to go, many places with her that was educational and interesting. And of course, we went to the White House, and Mrs. Roosevelt saw her at some writers group or some such. I mean, it was a small group that wasn't like a tourist group. So those were kind of, I guess, interesting things you were introduced to at that time. And I guess I haven't really thought that much about who else I might, but in the flying, of course, I had lots of Helen Hayes and Jackie Robinson, and just many celebrities. I suppose that's what they're called.
Yeah. Any little interesting stories with those that you think of, or anything that stands out in particular, even if they're not war related, or during that?
I was just always nice to see someone in person that you have admired. I suppose that's the bottom line. I mean,
Yeah.
there really isn't any particular thing that they all behaved so well and so cordial.
And that's when flying was
And it was, flying was really different because
yeah.
one, I guess some of the stories I've told about flying is we'd be flying over near Charleston over the mountains and the wings were icing up and I didn't realize how bad, and I'm up to the cockpit to ask the pilots if they want something and immediately do not say another word, go back, sit down. The wings were filled with ice and we could crash any minute, and it was one of the oldest, most pilots that I really respected the most. I thought, well, he can do it. He
Yeah.
can do it. But came close a lot of times, but somehow or another when you're young, you don't think it'll happen, do you? So anyway, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It's the beauty.
And then at what point did you come to Atlanta?
We came in, I believe it was 1952. We've been in Atlanta since 52. We were in New Orleans, lived there for a year, and a year in Charlotte, and then our third year of marriage, we came to Atlanta, and this is our home. And we have really enjoyed it. It has grown, as you well know, and it was really a real community when we came, and I feel we have maintained that where we've lived as a community, so I'm happy about that.
And have you been in the same neighborhood since you
We were in one neighborhood near a town at Sherwood Forest, and then we moved out to where we are now, which is out near Westminster Schools. That's where my children were.
Oh, okay.
So that's, we moved out there when they were 11 and 13 or so.
Okay. Anyway, let me see. I'm gonna